When the coach saw Jake Young at the gym, he immediately noticed something was wrong. Jake Young looked completely disheveled, an unusual sight for someone as composed as him. The coach thought to himself, I've never seen him like this before. He barely drinks, but now he looks like he's been on a binge. The coach sighed inwardly. I thought he'd bounce back quickly, but the shock must have hit him harder than I expected. I hope he recovers soon. It's hard not to worry when he's like this. Despite his concerns, the coach carried on. All right, he said, selecting a new recruit. We'll go with someone else. But as he finalized his decision, he let out a deep sigh, regret weighing heavily in his voice. It's really a shame. Doc Dan was the best fit for you. At the mention of Kim Dan's name, Jake Young visibly flinched. His demeanor changed entirely and he snapped, Don't talk about Kim Dan, his tone sharp and leaving no room for argument. The coach stammered, caught off guard by Jake Young's outburst. All right, he muttered, retreating from the subject. Doc Dan lingered in Jake Young's mind, triggering a splitting migraine, like a vice tightening around his skull. He pressed his temples and asked the coach, Do you have anything for migraines? The coach, trying to lighten the mood despite his frustration, replied, Again? You're always asking for meds when you drop by. How long have you been sick? Have you even seen a doctor? Jake Young brushed the concern aside. Yeah, I've already been. There's nothing. Just give me the pills. The coach sighed but didn't press further. Fine. Give me a second. As the rain poured outside, the sound of droplets echoed, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging within him. Back home, Jake Young was a complete mess. He lay slumped on the sofa in his living room, surrounded by empty wine bottles. His once proud demeanor was nowhere to be found. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Kim Dan haunted him, the last time he saw him, in tears, asking, Don't you trust me? The memory was relentless, and the migraine wouldn't give him peace. He suddenly sat up, clutching his head, and shouted into the empty room, What do you want from me, damn it? It was a pitiful sight, a champion brought low by guilt and regret. As his words echoed in the silence, Jake Young thought back to what the coach had said earlier. Doc Dan really was the best fit for you. Even now, Jake Young couldn't shake the thought that the coach might have been right. But back then, all he could see was betrayal. Before Kim Dan left, the coach had tried to defend him, pleading with Jake Young. There's no way Doc Dan is a spy, the coach had insisted. It's unthinkable. You were too hard on him this time. But Jake Young hadn't listened. And now, all he had were empty bottles, a pounding headache, and the ghost of Kim Dan's tears to keep him company. Jake Young sat on his sofa, his head pounding with a migraine as waves of regret consumed him. He couldn't stop replaying that heart-wrenching moment when Kim Dan had asked, Don't you trust me? Those words pierced his heart like a dagger, making the pain even worse. With a frustrated sigh, he crossed his legs and tried to justify his actions. What else was I supposed to do? He thought, frowning. I had every reason to doubt him. He wasn't doing his job right. And he knew it, that's why he left. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the persistent feeling of regret wouldn't let him rest. Why does it bother me so much? I was an idiot to let him into my home, he thought bitterly. Despite his harsh thoughts, one thing was clear. Jake Young missed Kim Dan deeply, even if he refused to admit it. And his attempts to convince himself otherwise only deepened his guilt. As the migraine worsened, he clutched his forehead in pain. These meds are useless, he muttered. Then, as if struck by a sudden revelation, he stood up and declared, Forget it. I'll just replace him with something new, like I always do. It was a desperate plan, a way to untangle the emotional knots tightening in his chest. He muttered again, as if to convince himself. Sooner or later, he'll fade from my mind like all the other nameless employees before him. But deep down, he probably knew it wouldn't be that simple. The scene shifted to the VIP section of the XY Club, where Jake Young was welcomed like a star. Without much fanfare, he told the bartender, Just give me something on the rocks. The bartender nodded and quickly prepared his drink. But Jake Young's attempt at escaping his thoughts of Kim Dan was immediately thwarted. The man sitting next to him at the counter bore an uncanny resemblance to Kim Dan. The stranger turned to Jake Young with a big, friendly smile and greeted him. "Hi, you're Jake Young, right? The MMA fighter." Jake Young scowled deeply, his mood souring further. Why does this guy look so much like him? He thought. Coming here to forget Kim Dan was already a long shot, and now fate had placed this lookalike right next to him. Unwilling to face the emotional turmoil, Jake Young stood up, ready to leave. But the stranger wasn't about to let him go. "You're even cuter in person," the lookalike said, stepping closer with a flirtatious tone. "Your face, I love looking at it. Why don't you let me take care of you?" Jake Young didn't respond. He stood there, glaring at the man with barely concealed irritation. He had come to the club to escape, but instead, he was being dragged deeper into his memories of Kim Dan. Jake Young's annoyance turned into full-blown anger. The newcomer, confused by the lack of response, thought, "That's strange. Maybe I should try something else." But his persistence was the final straw for Jake Young. When the lookalike leaned in as if to kiss him, Jake Young's eyes widened in shock. The migraine, the memories of Kim Dan, and the sheer audacity of this stranger pushed him to his breaking point. Without thinking, Jake Young shoved the man away, sending him to the ground with a dull thud. The lookalike called after him, "Hey, where are you going?" But Jake Young didn't look back. He stormed out of the club, his frustration boiling over. Back home, Jake Young went straight to the shower. He stood under the water, hoping it would wash away his anger, headache, and overwhelming memories. But instead of relief, all he could think about was Kim Dan. The doppelganger's face had only made things worse. Frustrated, Jake Young slammed his fist against the wall. The sound echoed through the bathroom as he muttered, "What am I even doing?" But of course, there was no answer. He was alone. The next morning, Jake Young was woken by the sound of the doorbell. When he opened the door, he found a cleaning crew standing there. "Hello, we're from the cleaning company," one of them said as they entered to deal with the disaster that was his home. As the cleaners began their work, one woman commented, "Look at all these wine bottles. Did you have friends over? You must have had quite a time." Although her tone carried a hint of judgment, Jake Young didn't respond. He simply sat on the sofa, head in his hands, lost in thought. Then another cleaner approached, breaking his reverie. "Mr. Young, the guest room on the second floor has been closed for a while. Would you like me to clean it this time?" The question hit Jake Young like a punch. That room had been Kim Dan's. He lifted his gaze, ready to snap. But instead of lashing out, he surprised himself by answering, "Go ahead." Even as he tried to forget Kim Dan, allowing the room to be cleaned felt like another step toward closure, or perhaps another reminder of how impossible it was to let him go. The cleaning crew had finally finished their work, and as they were about to leave, one of the women approached Jake Young with a red box. "Mr. Young, I found this while cleaning the guest room. It seemed valuable, so I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. You should take a look." She placed the box on the table, and the group left. "Take care, Mr. Young." But Jake Young didn't respond. His attention was entirely focused on the box. Once the cleaners had left and the door shut behind them, he hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Inside, he found a familiar keychain, the birthday gift Kim Dan had once excitedly given him. "This," Jake Young muttered, his voice tinged with regret. Memories flooded back. How Kim Dan had gone to great lengths to buy him an expensive gift, even taking extra jobs to afford it. And how had Jake Young responded? By throwing the gift back in his face, belittling his efforts, and dismissing his thoughtfulness entirely. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of the box was a letter, a birthday card. Jake Young's eyes widened as he read the heartfelt message. "Dear Mr. Young, happy birthday. I am deeply grateful for everything you've done for me. Thanks to you, my life has become easier, and I can finally breathe again. I prepared a small gift for your birthday as a token of my gratitude. I hope you like it. I know I'm not perfect, but I will do my best to work even harder. I hope to truly collaborate with you for many years." Jake Young's expression darkened as he reread the words. The card was raw, genuine, and even scratched in places where Kim Dan had clearly struggled to find the right words. One part in particular caught his attention. "I hope to be," followed by a heavily scratched out section. Jake stared at the smudged words, his mind racing. What was he going to write? "I hope to be what?" He clutched the letter tightly, almost as if it could provide him with answers. His mind drifted back to the day Kim Dan nervously handed him the gift. He remembered how the boy's hands had trembled, how vulnerable he had seemed, and how had Jake Young responded? With coldness and disdain. But this moment of tortured reflection was interrupted by a sudden notification on his phone. Startled, Jake put the items down and went to check the message. What is it now? He thought, already irritated. But what he saw on the screen only made things worse. A bank transfer notification. His heart sank. What is this? Upon closer inspection, he realized the transfer was from none other than Kim Dan. The universe seemed to be conspiring against him, refusing to let him forget. Everything, the keychain, the letter, and now this bank transfer, seemed to lead back to Kim Dan. It was too much. Jake Young's mind returned to the promise Kim Dan had once made. "At the end of every month, I'll transfer money to repay the debt you helped me settle." And now, here it was. He frowned deeply, tightening his grip on the phone. "He must be joking," Jake muttered. "How does he think he can pay it all back with this?" The amount was $1,500. To Kim Dan, it must have been significant, but to Jake Young, it was nothing but a drop in the ocean compared to what Kim Dan actually owed. What is Kim Dan thinking? The gesture felt almost mocking, a reminder of everything unresolved between them. No matter how much Jake Young wanted to move forward, Kim Dan's presence lingered like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Kim Dan himself. Sitting alone on a park bench, he stared at his phone, lost in thought. He had just made the transfer, and though it wasn't much, it was all he could afford for now. His expression was contemplative, tinged with worry, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. As the wind rustled through the park, Kim Dan remained seated, his thoughts as restless as the breeze. And that's the end of this chapter. Guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps our channel.